We are live. I think we're live. I'm going to assume we're live. I am Grant Faulkner, Executive Director of NaNoWriMo, and welcome to our special Double Up Donation Weekend webcast. Four special author guests with us, YA novelists, and they publish novels with Macmillan. And I'll just introduce them in a second after I go through some things about the show. There are just 2 days before NaNoWriMo starts on November 1st, so there's plenty of time to come up with a novel idea and think about it if you haven't signed up yet, so I encourage you to sign up. And before we start though, I want to thank Macmillan Fierce Reads for providing, we have 4 great prizes if you donate in the next hour. Right now we're doing what we call Double Up Donation Day Weekend, and Catherine will put a link in the chat if you want to donate. And we have, if you donate in the next hour, we have 5 prizes, I guess. No, 4. One is a first chapter critique by Jessica Anderson, who is an associate editor at Christy Ottaviano Books, an imprint of Macmillan's. And then we have 3 book bundles. And these book bundles will include all 4, each one will include all 4 books that we're featuring today. So you'll learn about these books. You can donate, and then you can win them. I'll have to go off screen to pick up those books. Anyway, yeah, so you can also buy those books to support the Odyssey Bookshop. It's an indie bookstore, and Catherine will also put a link up in chat to Odyssey so that you can buy them directly from Odyssey. So support your local independent bookstore and support NaNoWriMo. We've actually raised $21,000 of our $150,000 fundraising goal. And we just started a $5,000 match from Marissa Meyer, who is another Macmillan author. And she's done NaNoWriMo for years. I'm not even sure what year she first did NaNoWriMo, but she wrote the novel Cinder during that NaNoWriMo. And she's written many of her novels since then in NaNoWriMo or with that NaNoWriMo framework of writing 50,000 words of a novel in 30 days. So one more thing about this weekend. The reason it's called Double Up Donation Weekend is that we're doubling the goodies. So if you donate $25, you'll get our donor goodies for the $50 level. So you can check that out on the website. And this is going to go through all the way through November 1st on Sunday. That's when NaNoWriMo begins. And November 1st, we have a goal to write 140 million words as a collective community. This would be a record, a world record throughout history. No one has recorded 140 million words written in one day. So please join in. I think we can go beyond 140 million words, actually. So to kick things off, well, first, I'm going to pick up these 2 books on the floor. I'll be right back. I'm back. And I'm going to read each author's bio and ask them to answer a question. What is their favorite or best writing advice they've received, or their worst writing advice? And you can see if that worst writing advice might be your best or opposite. So I'm going to first introduce Echo Brown. She is a writer who relocated from France to Cleveland. Echo was known first as a performer for her one-woman show, Black Virgins Are Not for Hipsters, and then she moved on to mold-breaking autobiographical young adult fiction novels that are full of magical realism. Her first book, Black Girl Unlimited, The Remarkable Story of a Teenage Wizard. She wrote this in a cafe next to the Eiffel Tower, where everyone should write their books, I think, while she drank hot chocolate. It's one of the best author stories I've read recently. And when an interviewer asked her to describe the novel in 5 words, she said, Harry Potter meets The Wire. So if that doesn't intrigue you, I don't know what will. Echo is working on her 2nd book, which will be published by Macmillan in 2022. Thank you for joining us, Echo. And I'm curious, what is the best writing advice you've received, or the worst?
So the best writing advice I ever received was from my English teacher at Dartmouth, my introductory English teacher, so my first year there. And he told me to write from the electricity, so to write from this kind of internal spark. And the worst advice that I have ever heard or seen was when I was in Paris. I was teaching a writing workshop, and another woman was there, and she was kind of helping me with it. And she said, oh, I want to write something that's really interesting, but I'm afraid I'm not that interesting. And I really just don't think you should try to be interesting. I think it should just kind of come through. And if you try to be interesting, in my opinion, then it puts all this pressure. So those are the two pieces of advice.
Why was that the worst?
Well, because it was a block for her, right? So she wanted to write this book. She always wanted to be a writer, she said, but she felt like she didn't have anything interesting to say. But then trying to be interesting became the block.
Oh, yeah.
I wouldn't try to be interesting. I would just try to find what's coming through me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think too many people put obstacles in front of themselves and their novel writing ideas by saying it's not original enough or not interesting enough.
Exactly.
And yeah. I forgot to say one thing when I was giving the preview of everything is that I'm going to ask the authors here questions for about a half an hour, and then we'd love to answer attendee questions. So please put your questions in chat, and Catherine Grip, who is producing this, will pass the questions on to me, and we'll try to get to all of them today. So please put your questions in chat. I am going to, next up is Katie Rose Poole. And Katie is the author of the Age of Darkness trilogy. We have There Will Come a Darkness. What a great title. She was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, and after graduating from UC Berkeley with a degree in history, Katie spent a few years building websites by day and dreaming up prophecies by night. Currently, she resides in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she can be found eating breakfast sandwiches, rooting for the Golden State Warriors, and reading books that set her on fire. And I want to note that Katie has done NaNoWriMo, she said, tons of times in the past, starting way back when she was 14 years old. Welcome, Katie.
Hi.
Yeah, well, tell me what your best advice you've received or the worst advice you've received. People love giving authors advice, right?
That is true. I think some of the best advice that I've ever received, and I feel is like very salient for a project like NaNoWriMo, is that there's no such thing as a wasted word. I think it can be really easy as a writer to feel like, when you're writing and it doesn't feel right, and you're like, I don't know if the plot's going in the right direction, and maybe you decide it's not. Like all of that time that you spent on those scenes that you have to throw out, it can feel super just like demoralizing if you're like, oh, I have to start all over again. But truly, I think, and my process has shown me that those moments of writing something that's not quite right or not there yet, I need those words to get me to the right ones. And so anytime I'm writing, like it's always, I'm just putting in the work, and whatever falls out at the end of it, like that's kind of what I needed to do to get there.
That is such great advice. And this is coming from one who just cut 10,000 words from a novel in my last round of revision. I can't tell you how great it felt to cut those 10,000 words, but after a while, you don't even tally up the amount of time that went in to write them originally, because like you said, you have to go down certain paths and see where they lead before you know if they work or not. And that is one big, I always call NaNoWriMo, actually, I don't even call it a rough draft anymore. I think of it as a discovery draft. You're exploring your story. Yeah. And so write those thousands of words and make them fun, and you'll likely cut a lot of them, but you might find some gems, both the storylines and words. So Christina Forrest is up next, and Christina is the author of 2 YA romance novels, including I Want Where You Are, and Now That I've Found You. I'm not sure how these covers are coming through online, but I'll hold them up. She earned her MFA in creative writing with a concentration in writing for children at the New School. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, with 2 huge bookshelves. I'm curious if they have spawned a 3rd bookshelf, as bookshelves likely often do. And Christina said that she's never officially done NaNoWriMo, but she has written 50,000 words in a month on multiple occasions. So welcome, Christina, and I'm curious what your best or worst writing advice is.
The best, I guess it's sort of a 2-parter. The best advice, I can't remember who said it, but it was an author who was doing a panel somewhere years ago. I want to say it might have been Holly Black, but she said, read often and read widely, but specifically read the genre that you want to write. And I think that's really great advice. And also one of my professors encouraged me to outline, because And I know it's different for everyone, but I have found that outlining really works for me, especially because I write romantic comedies and they sort of follow a specific structure. But she just sort of like, your draft is all over the place. Maybe you should go back and see if you can outline. And I was like, oh, that's an idea. And I've done it ever since.
Do you outline before you write a novel or after you've written a draft to kind of structure it?
Every book is different. I try to outline as much as I can before time. And then sometimes I just get so anxious and ready to write, or if I'm on a deadline, I don't have time to plan anymore. I have to start writing. And then after a draft, I will go back and sort of storyboard it, which is, I guess like another form of outlining to sort of try to see the physical book. It really depends on the book though, but at each stage I try to step back and look at the outline again.
That's a good lesson though, because every book does take, I always advise people to experiment during NaNoWriMo, try something that you've never done. And sometimes people think you have to outline before you write a draft, and oftentimes people do that outline after writing a draft. So that's cool. Well, next up is Margaret Owen, who also goes by Molly, so I'll probably call her both during the webcast to satisfy your parents who named you. Yeah,
I'll be very grateful.
Margaret was born and raised at the end of the Oregon Trail, and she first encountered an author in the wild in 4th grade. We'll have to hear about that. And roughly 20 seconds later, she decided that she too would be an author, the first of many well thought out life decisions. After a detour to Seattle, where she worked in everything from thrift stores to presidential campaigns, jobs which she sums up as lessons were learned. My resume is cluttered with those as well. She returned to her 4th grade self and became a writer. She's written The Merciful Crow duology and Little Thieves. And I want to say before Margaret comes up that today when I was like Googling you and researching you a bit, the strangest fact came up that I think is relevant to NaNoWriMo. I don't think this is you, but on October 21st in 1918, Margaret Owen set a typing speed record of 170 words per minute on a manual typewriter. So was that you in 1918?
I could be like the Doctor and just have regenerated again, but I feel like this timeline would be a lot different if I had that whole framework of powers. But I would like to think that perhaps this is evidence of time travel, as I do type very fast.
Yeah, that's an amazing, that might have been the first NaNoWriMo.
There we go.
On a manual typewriter.
Just in a week, knocked it out.
Well, tell us, what is the best or the worst writing advice you've received?
So I'm going to say something that is controversial but brave, as it were, for NaNoWriMo. The worst writing advice that I've ever seen is write every day, and you have to write every day. If you don't, you're not a writer. But that's going to go hand in hand with the best advice that I've ever received, which is something I read about from, I think, Chuck Palahniuk, who said, every day, try to, or at least, if you are trying to get work done and you're stuck, set a timer, write for half an hour, and just half an hour. If it's working for you, you will keep going. If it's not, then you've gotten a little bit of work done at least, or you've tried. But yeah, ultimately, I think there's a lot of focus on productivity and doing things every day, and you have to develop these Hemingway-esque routines to be considered a real writer, and that's nonsense. There's no such thing as a real writer.
Yeah, it's how you define it, what works for you in the end. And sometimes writers need a day off.
Yeah. We sure do. Sometimes you have to fill the well. And my greatest months of productivity have sometimes had, days or two when I just have stared at a ceiling for most of the day.
Exactly.
Also 2020, but
Well, I'm going to jump into some questions here. And per my internet research, I am intrigued. I'm intrigued by writing the novel Near the Eiffel Tower while drinking hot chocolate in the cafe. But I'm also intrigued by Echo's writing style, which is a very intense and obsessive writing style. I read that you block off chunks of time to write, and you write pretty intensely. Like I read that you wrote the initial draft of your book by writing 12 hours a day for a week, which is a extreme NaNoWriMo, I'm guessing. So can you tell us why this approach works for you, this intense output?
Yeah, and I think for me, my process, I don't know if it's different or maybe other people write like this also. So for me, it's more of a channeling. I just try to get on the right channel. And then once I'm on the right channel, the whole thing just comes through. So the reason I write in such big periods of time is because I really can't turn it off once it's on. Like the story will just keep coming, and then details, and then I'm afraid that I'm going to forget. So then I'll write it down. I wrote part of that book in California. I like to do a lot of writing in my car. So I would go drive to the ocean, the Berkeley Marina, actually. I don't know if it's like the confined space, or I like to feel like a prisoner where I have no other choice. I don't know. But I wrote it there. And then I also wrote part of it at the American Library in Paris, which is right next to the Eiffel Tower. I had a little desk in the top of the library. So yeah, so for me, my process is more about channeling. For me, it's a very spiritual process. I just have to kind of, find the right channel, and then the whole thing just comes out. So I really don't struggle a lot with writing blocks, or like, if there's a block, I just ask, well, what should come next? And then I wait, and then the thing comes. So I really try hard not to put up any blocks for the channel.
That's really interesting. And I love that. I keep talking to writers who write in their cars. And so I think we need to collect an anthology or something of writers who've written their books in their cars. Because it is a very peaceful place to write, actually.
It's confined.
It's confined, yeah. Well, I'm curious, do any of our other writers here, do any of you write in a kind of a method of channeling? I think that one thing that's very similar to NaNoWriMo is I think that NaNoWriMo at its best, it can lead to that kind of flow state, just because you are stretching yourself and going for more words, and you're having like that kind of little bit of pressure put on you. But does anyone else write so strenuously like that?
Absolutely not. I feel so envious of this process, because I feel like half of the work that I do while writing each day is just like getting out of my own way, and like that in itself is such a process for me. And kind of, I think, yeah, when you do kind of hit a flow, which to me happens relatively rarely. I wouldn't say that on most of my writing days I hit a good flow, and yet somehow the work gets done. So I love that, like, we have these two completely different processes, but they both work. Yours sounds kind of joyful, and I am always trying to find ways to make the writing process more joyful for myself, because a lot of the time it is me kind of feeling bad while I work. And the moments when it is joyful and when I do hit that flow are that's always kind of what I'm striving for. But I think it's really hard for me to get there.
How about you, Molly or Christina? Are you fast, intense writers or slow writers, or nothing wrong with being a slow writer?
I find that beginnings are always the slowest for me. I will take a long time on like the first 15K, but I always, in my mind, writing a novel for me is like climbing a mountain. Then once you get to the top, you just roll down and like you can't stop it. So I do, like, once I reach a certain point, like I guess the climax and on, I do get in those modes where I just have to keep going, or otherwise like I'll lose momentum. But it's never, the first half is never that easy.
I found that something that's helped me a lot is a program called Pacemaker that's just available for free, and you set a target, and it tells you basically how many more words you need to write per day to do that, or to meet your target. And I've found that particularly helpful because it does give me more of a, okay, well, on my off days, I only need to hit this number to actually be on target. And on my good days, I can get very far ahead of where I need to be. But in general, I know the first chapter or so of a manuscript is pretty easy, and I will just yarf that right out. And then it's kind of a little bit of a maintenance cycle of, sometimes it's really easy if I for the rest of the first act, the second act. Sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes I need to go back and re-outline stuff or outline it more in detail. But then once I get to the end, it's like someone goes into my brain and just rips the brakes out. And then I'll just stare at my laptop and just for like 2 days solid, which is also coincidentally usually 2 days around my deadline. So it works out great.
Well, that's great, because what I find in my observing NaNoWriMo writers is that there are periods, even within a 30-day period, where people sometimes they're fast out of the gate, they hit the wall in the middle and kind of have a really tough time writing, and then they'll get a second or third win towards the end. So just because you have a bad day or two, or even a week, don't quit. You will get a second or third win. Your story will speak to you, I think. Yeah. Well, one thing I think when I'm asked, like, what is the key advice to succeed in NaNoWriMo, I oftentimes don't give writing advice. I give time management advice, because I think, like, you have to figure out how you're going to write 1,700 words a day. And for me, that takes 2 hours a day. And so I have to figure out, how can I open up 2 hours in my day to write? And so for some people that might take an hour, for some it might take 3 hours. You have to figure out how it's going to fit into your life. And Christina, I read that one of your biggest challenges is finding time to write. And I know that you work a full-time job, or I think you work a full-time job in publishing, as I read. And so I'm just curious, do you have any advice to give writers about how to figure out how to find the time to write?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I keep muting myself because I live in Brooklyn on a busy road, and there are like cops and firefighters driving by every 5 minutes. So if that happens, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Yes, I have to stick to a schedule. Otherwise, the book just won't get written, especially because, I don't know if it's because I'm a Capricorn or what, but I put a lot of pressure on myself to get things done. So I have to come up with a schedule, and I try to do 3 days a week starting out. I'll try to do 3 days a week. Usually as the deadline goes on, I'll bump it up to 4 to 5 days. But I try to block out at least 2 to 3 hours in the evening. I at least try to get 1,000 words. And I know that might not necessarily be helpful if you're trying to win NaNoWriMo to get to 50K. But I think just training yourself to try to get to a certain number will help you to get to the next one. So like, I always shoot for 1,000. I usually end up somewhere at 2,000. But like once I get to that 1,000, I'm like, oh, okay. And then the next half comes pretty easily. But I think it's like you were saying, time management for me is more of a difficult thing to get a hold onto than the actual writing once I'm on a schedule.
Yeah, that's interesting that you write at night, because that's the time I can't write.
Yeah.
But one of the stories I love telling people is that Toni Morrison, when she wrote her first novel, she was a single working mom in New York City. She was also working in publishing, I believe. And she came home, made dinner for her kids, helped them with their homework, got them to bed. And she only had about 15 minutes before she needed to sleep herself. But she used that 15 minutes to write. And I think the valuable lesson there is to use the increments of time that are available to you. And that applies to NaNoWriMo, just because you might like write during your lunch break, you might write for 15 minutes when you wake up, something like that. A lot of people have different strategies. Does anyone else have a writing time management strategy to share?
I find that I actually have the opposite. I'm kind of, well, so I work full-time as a writer. And when I switched from balancing a full-time job and writing to just writing full-time, I found it was actually very difficult to get myself to say, this is dedicated writing time, because I didn't have that external pressure of, oh, well, now I have to, I have only this much time before I have to go to bed and then get up and go to work in the morning. And so what I found, and I think a lot of folks who are now working from home are now sort of trying to find their own strategies for this, is that I had to kind of do an internal audit of everything that was a distraction in my workspace, which was now my home, and figure out how I was procrastinating and what ways I was tricking myself into not working on writing, and just start eliminating those one by one. And a lot of the time it was just, oh, well, I'll tell myself that I can do some art thing, and then I'll start writing in 2 hours. Oh, now I'm too tired and distracted. Or, oh, I'll just take a look at Twitter, and 5 hours later, I'm furious and I've done nothing. What I found is the best thing for time management was just shutting myself off from distractions as much as possible. And so doing things like getting the browser blockers, getting the app forest, which I saw went down today, but hopefully it will have returned. But, you know, figuring out like, okay, well, if I block this on, or if I block something on a browser, am I going to just pick up my phone and block, or, you know, and look at it on that too? All right, well then we're taking the phone away too. The phone goes away. You can't have any nice things until you actually get your work done.
Yeah, I don't know if this really falls under time management, but the sort of best strategy that I've found to just like self-motivating is to have accountability with someone else. I think writing is such a solitary endeavor a lot of the time, but if you have a friend who is also writing, or even just also getting some kind of work done in like a period of time, I find that so helpful. So I have a group of writer friends who will like check in with each other and be like, okay, I'm going to try to write for the next hour. When the hour's up, we check back in, like, what did you get done? How'd you do? And it's kind of a no judgment zone. So you can be honest and be like, oh, I got distracted. I didn't really do this. And kind of like collaborate together on building those routines and creating accountability with yourself. And then it's also just like a nice, you know, you have a little social interaction in between your writing sessions. So you're not just all by yourself, isolated.
Yeah, I think that's part of the premise of NaNoWriMo, emphasizing the community aspect and having municipal liaisons who organize, you know, writing events or gatherings in their towns. And also the community on the NaNoWriMo website is just to check in, it's just to ask people how much they've written that day or if they've written.
Yeah, and I think that really helps, just like an exponential amount, at least for me.
Yeah. How about you, Echo? Anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say for myself, it's really interesting to hear other people's sort of tricks and tips, because I could never do this. I can't write from pressure. Like I feel if I put myself under pressure, if I say you have to do it within this window or you have to check with this person, for me, it would become a block. So I actually like to be free in within my writing space. I like to be like, oh, what will I write? You know? Mm-hmm. And so I don't ever put like blocks or like, but I also have the privilege of not having to do that because I don't work a 9-to-5 job either. But yeah, so for me, it's really important to get into a space that has no pressure, no restrictions. Otherwise, I feel like I can't flow or I'm not, you know, in that state. So I don't at all put, I have to write for 30 minutes or I have to check in with this person. It's like me and God or something. It's like, what do you want me to say, God? That's how it feels for me.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm going to shift topics to research. And Katie, I read that you did a lot of research into ancient technology for There Will Come a Darkness. So I was wondering if you could tell us how your research informed the book, and I guess what led you to decide that you needed to do a significant amount of research.
I really think that I did it because I wanted to do it. There was no point. I guess at some point there must have been, you know, during the world building process for like a second world fantasy, you're kind of like starting from scratch in some ways, which is very freeing, but can also be a little bit scary. So I think getting to do that kind of research was just like a way of grounding that world building process for me. And like, I would just get really obsessed with something like the sort of system of cisterns in ancient Alexandria, which like does feature in the book, but it's really only there because I was like, this is really cool. And I want to like learn more about this. And I want to see if this will fit into the book or not. And I think the sort of challenge with research for me is it's really easy to go down those rabbit holes and you don't always know if they're going to be fruitful or not, or if you're going to feel like at the end of it, like this is not, none of this is going to go into the book. But kind of like I said at the beginning, like I don't really ever think that research is wasted. I think it's always like, I personally feel like my brain just lights up when I'm learning new things. And like, this is the very sort of like, I don't know, I guess this is the environment I was raised in, the type of person I am. But those things, even if they don't really ultimately land in the book, they're just sort of those jumping off points to get me really excited about a certain aspect of world building of whatever it is. So yeah, I do it because I enjoy it.
Yeah. I sometimes joke that there could be an official category of novelists like who are just novel researchers. That's all they do is research novels because it can be so pleasurable. I'm curious, has anyone else, do you guys research your novels beforehand?
Mine are memoir based, so it's really not a lot of, research that has to go. Maybe I'll look up details about Cleveland at that time or about, the time period, but I don't do a lot of research.
Mm-hmm. Christina or Molly?
I definitely do a lot of research, but since I primarily write in second world fantasy, it's kind of like, let me see what's available, or let me see what resources are available, let me see what's accurate, and then I'm going to ignore that. I'm just going to make something up. But it's good to help, and it's definitely a good sort of springing off point for me a lot of the time. But also I don't try to have a full Wikipedia cited article for every part of the book, just because I don't want it to get bogged. I don't want research to be a limitation for fantasy. I want it to be something that things can grow from, like a beautiful mushroom.
I think research can be inhibiting, and sometimes you can do too much of it and it makes you feel like you have to put it all in.
Exactly.
Christine, any last takes on research?
I avoid research at all costs.
Yeah.
I really do. The reason that I made Chloe a ballerina is because I was a ballerina and I knew I wouldn't have to do that much research. Yeah, but I mean, sometimes it's necessary depending on the book, but so far I have avoided it.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. Like a lot of people, again, like in terms of obstacles, the reason I was joking about some novelists becoming professional researchers is that I think it can be a real obstacle, or people can feel like they need to know so much about a world before they write about it. And I think as you said, Margaret, is that's so, you've got a lot within you, especially in the realm of fantasy. And I'm curious because you are known for your world building and for breaking the rules or pushing the boundaries. And what would you tell somebody writing, maybe starting their first fantasy novel, this NaNoWriMo, how to break those boundaries and push those imagined realms?
Well, I would say I got away with the magic system based on human teeth, so the sky's the limit, kid.
Tell us how that worked. Magic based on human teeth. Let's understand that sky.
Let's crack that one open. So let's take a bite out of that one. I'm just going to keep on coming up with puns if nobody stops me. The just in very short explanation of that is that the main character is able to call magic from the magic that a person has from their teeth. Like, so if she has the magic of a fire, or if she has the tooth that belonged to someone who was able to have fire magic, she would be able to use, like, basically hold that tooth and call the magic out of it for a very short period of time. So it's, the way I like to explain it is, if you have like Superman, imagine Superman can only use one of his powers at a time if he has a special magic tooth corresponding to that power, and it only lasts for 5 minutes. So let's hope that the flying one is a very short trip. But yeah, I would say the thing with breaking rules and sort of breaking boundaries and going into new areas with fantasy is that, I mean, it's the same sort of story, or the same idea that you have with stylization in art, in that you need to know the rules before you can break the rules successfully. So this is why you see a lot of people being like, I'm going to do a groundbreaking story about a boy who goes to a magic school in England. And you're like, oh, got to do some genre research there, but you can tell when someone isn't familiar with the genre and with the rules. And so I would say, if you want to do new stuff, if you want to find new parts of the landscape in fantasy, you have to understand what parts of the landscape have been covered. And, what has already been charted, because there's still plenty of uncharted stuff out there. It's just, it's going to require you to think a little bit outside the box, and sometimes it's outside the vocal box. But Had to get another
So I'm slow. I'm slow on these, by the way, Molly. So I got it now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, I just checked chat, and there are tons of questions here. So I'm going to go to our attendees' questions, and I'm just going to throw them out there to all of you. So jump in. Holly asks, how do you guys get inspiration for your stories? And I think I'm just going to ask, do you wait for inspiration to strike before you write, or do you write when you're uninspired sometimes?
I never write when I'm uninspired, because for me, it just feels like the words are so hollow and they're so empty. And the inspiration for me, it's where you feel like the meat and you feel like that electricity. So I'm always, I guess you could say, searching for that or trying to call that. The first sentence of that book, My Mother is a Wizard, I was on a plane somewhere and that sentence came, and it has so much electricity, and it had so many roots to it. Obviously, it was, the whole book was linked to that. So I'm always kind of waiting for those things rather than trying to, for me, force it, because then it's just, for me, there's no point. So once it comes and it's there, then, and luckily it comes often, I feel like, for me.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like this question is kind of a false dichotomy between like waiting for inspiration to strike and working regardless. For me, it's more about trying to seek out inspiration and finding the things that do inspire me, and that I can always kind of turn to if I'm like, I don't want to just like stare at this Word document and like feel blah. Like, I want to feel excited. I want to be inspired. And so that could be research. That could be rereading a scene that I really liked. That could be listening to music. It could be so many different things. But I think it's really you're an active participant in getting inspired. It's not just something that happens, at least not for me.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Margaret and Christina, any final words?
Christina?
Inspiration?
I try to wait for it, but I think I end up getting a lot of ideas while I'm in the middle of another book. So I'll just open up my phone notes app and write them down. So then in the moments where I feel like my well is dried up, I'll go back to the notes app and be like, oh yeah, I had those ideas before. So it's a little bit of both, I guess.
It's really important to have whatever writing accoutrement you like to write down your moments of inspiration. Yeah, they do come in the strangest of places sometimes, in the strangest of times. So it's good to be able to record them. Yeah.
I I have definitely done the notes app line, and that's led to some very strange things that I find. It's little presents that I leave for my future self that make absolutely no sense. I'll open my phone and it'll be like, dog that eats something. Huh. Well, I'm sure that would be an award winner someday somewhere.
Yeah, that's the title of your next book, Dog That Eats Something.
Dog That Eats Something. But I found that it's not necessarily inspiration that I need so much as I approach writing sort of in large and also on a scene by scene level as a series of goals and landmarks that I'm working towards. And so I need to know where the scene is leading, where the story's going. I always need to know the end. And the process of getting to that point, usually, it winds up having a lot of fun discoveries along the way. But at the same time, or, I can't tell you how many times I'll be in the middle of a scene and I'll be like, oh, that's how I'm going to solve the thing that I haven't figured out yet in Act 3, which is why Act 3 is so much more fun for me, because I've already written all my solutions. But I found that inspiration is a continual process. And while I may not need to be inspired, like light bulbs firing, to keep on working towards something, I still need to know what I'm working towards, at least.
Yeah, there's big I inspiration and little I inspiration, I think. And just like you guys have all said, I think you are a participant in inspiration. You create it through the act of kind of sitting down to write oftentimes. I think one sentence leads to another sentence generally. This next question is interesting because it goes beyond the page. And I think one of the things that we advise people in NaNoWriMo is to try to banish your inner editor and to really just let the words come out, to almost, write like no one's reading, you know, like just like that saying, dance like no one is watching. So, but this person, Deborah Jo, asks, how can a new writer make their busy family understand how important their creative practice is to them without either side getting frustrated? So I'm just sensing there that there's maybe some disapproval of the writer, of Deborah Jo. And if you guys have had people who've been blocks for you, or been, you know, whatever, not welcoming to your writing, how have you dealt with that? Especially if, I guess she probably lives with her family, it sounds like.
I think a trick that has worked for me is to switch out the verbs. And so like, instead of saying I'm going to write, it's I'm going to work. This is, you know, whether or not you're a published author who is getting paid for it, like this is something that you are taking seriously because you want it to be a career of some sort. And so it's still work. And if you look at it that way and you tell it that way to other people, I think it'll at least make you feel better. So if they are still negative, then that's them. But I think that it's helped me to say, I'm actually going to work right now. I can't talk, or I can't do this because I'm working. Because I think that people who aren't writers don't always understand that a creative thing isn't just a hobby, you know? So I guess that's my advice.
That's great. Make it more serious. It's not just playing around for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Anything, anybody else want to add anything? Yeah, go ahead, Molly.
I just want to say, so when I was growing up, the two things that I loved most in the world, and I did the best in at school, just unequivocally across the board, were art and writing. And so my parents were terrified because they were like, well, great, she'll never have a real job. And I internalized that, and I did not get a degree in college that was related to art or writing. I did not work for a very long time in art or writing. And when I sold my books, that was the most money I'd ever made in my entire life. So anyone who tells you that doing what you love cannot be a serious career does not know what they're talking about. And I think the reality is that it can be difficult for people to separate the idea that you can love your career and it's still a job, and you can love your work but it's still work, especially when it comes to creative work. For some reason that just doesn't mesh with people's understanding of work but fun, and if you cannot, or if people are not taking you seriously when you are working and they're not respecting your time, I would say within legal limits, set those boundaries as firmly as possible and say, this is my work time and you need to respect that. And if you cannot respect me in this space, then I will find another space to get my work done.
Good advice. Katie or Echo, anything to add?
I think for me, because I don't like to get involved in other people's negative narratives or other people's negative perceptions about this kind of work, if I was in that position, and I'm lucky that I haven't been in that position, I think I would just be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go to the grocery store, and then come back like 3 hours later, just because I think that when you allow people's negativity to infiltrate you when you need to be in a different space to produce this work, or to, find the inspiration or whatever, or, trying to create, then that kind of pressure can really become a block, and it can really sort of shut you down internally if you're not careful. So I spend a lot of time kind of avoiding people's negativity traps, right? So that means I'm just not going to participate. I'm not going to try to be defensive. I'm not going to say, hey, why don't you understand? I'm like, hey, I'm going to go outside and water the lawn, and then I'll come back 4 hours later. You know what I mean? I know that's not always possible because, if you have a family, you can't just disappear from your kids for 4 hours. Like, where are you? But I think it's better to try if you can. Sometimes you can't when you live with people, but it's better to just try to avoid the negativity altogether so that it doesn't become an internal block for you. And so you keep your freedom space, your creative space. So that's how I would approach it.
That's good advice. You can't solve them sometimes. You just have to create space for yourself. Yeah. Katie, any final words?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just all really comes down to setting boundaries, like Molly said. And I think the best way to set boundaries is to be short, to the point, and consistent. And just when it's time to write, you're like, this is my writing time for the next, whatever it is, for the next 2 hours, I am writing. Please don't disturb me. And if they do disturb you, then it's I'm writing now. Can we talk about this later? And just kind of set those boundaries like as much as possible. And I think like if you're really consistent about it, most of the time, hopefully reasonable people in your life will start to get the picture and be like, okay, this is something they're really doing.
Yeah, that's good. Boundaries, 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 definitely. Well, Rachel Richardson asks, and we get this question a lot, do you ever worry when you write that you might be echoing something else you've read or watched? And so I think this gets to the question of originality. And I hear from people sometimes that they, either that they feel like they're being unduly influenced from other sources, or they'll just not write their novel because they don't feel it's original enough. What advice would you guys give? I'll start with Echo. How about that?
So I know internally, I know when I'm writing from ego, which is usually other people's voice, or I'm trying to write towards some idea that I think it should be, or, I'm thinking about my Goodreads reviews. Well, what are they going to say now? So I know when I'm writing from that space because there's no roots to it. That's how it feels. It feels hollow, like hollowness or something. Whereas when I'm writing from the inspiration place we've been talking about, when I'm writing from the depths, it feels very rooted. And I almost have like a feeling in my stomach that like there's the electricity. So I tend to search for that feeling. I search for that electric kind of rooted feeling. And I try to write from that space. And then when I'm in this other place, I know that I'm kind of like, I'm like, thinking about all these ideas or, maybe something that I heard. So for me, it's searching for that feeling, like that kind of click feeling. And then I know I'm in the right space. So that's how I differentiate the two.
Yeah, it's about your intention. I get that, or what it is a feeling in a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah, it's like a feeling. Like you can feel the roots of the story.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes practice personally, and maybe the first thing you ever write isn't going to be the most original idea in the universe, and maybe it is going to be, oh, I really liked such and such thing. Like the first book I ever wrote when I was 8 was like Sailor Moon and Dungeons and Dragons. Like it was not original. And I think that's kind of just part of the process of figuring out who you are as a writer. I don't think you're always going to know right off, who that person is, who the writer you is. And I think it takes just like a lot of reading, a lot of writing, until you sort of trust your own instincts and trust your own storytelling ability. I think it is really hard to do that. And so it's kind of one of those things that my advice is just don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Like, especially when you're starting out, just don't worry about that.
I agree. I think we form ourselves through our influences, just like our own personalities in the world. We're obviously influenced by the people we mimic as kids. That's how kids learn so much. And I think that fan fiction, as you mentioned, like serves that role. You're writing within a sphere. I also think you put your own imprint on things. Like, so Margaret, I'm curious, you said earlier that somebody decided to write about a boy who goes to a magic school. I think that somebody could write that originally. I mean, because I would write it different than J.K. Rowling did, I think.
Right. You would just have to know, it would be going back to knowing what has been charted and what territory has been charted, what territory hasn't. And I was just thinking about this. I think the important thing whenever you're trying to sort of, when you love something and you want to make it your own, or you want to make something like that gives you the same kind of feeling, what's important is to understand what it is about that particular part of that story, that character, that narrative, that joke. Even what is it that reaches you? Like one thing I've been thinking about a lot is the Cinderella story and why it appeals to so many people. And I think for me, if I were to ever write a Cinderella retelling, what would really be sort of the impactful moment for me is the moment where you have this girl who has been sort of looked down and trodden upon all of her life, basically standing before this royal palace saying, I am good enough to be here. And that, I think, you know, if you can capture that, oh, my cat's being very helpful. Thanks. Thanks, bud. You know, if you can capture that, that particular thing that speaks to you about something that may not necessarily be original, you can still make it your own. And since there is nobody else, like, this is going to be very Disney cheesy, but since there is no one else out there who has had your exact experience, who has lived your exact life, making something your own makes it original unto itself.
Mm-hmm. Christina, have you struggled with this question of originality?
No, personally, no, because I write romances with Black teens and there still aren't enough of those kinds of books. So I'm not like internally thinking about that when I'm writing. But to Katie's point, I think that you can't let that stop you. If you feel like you're writing something that's a little reminiscent of something else, just keep going till you finish, and then you can, you know, look at that in revisions. But I don't think you should let that stop you. I think it's natural for people to do that. So
absolutely. This next question comes from Brianna Gordon. I think it's like the $50 million question today. How do you plan out your story ideas? And I'm thinking of this because I think a lot of people feel like they don't have enough time to plan a novel before November 1st. And just for our attendees, we have a kind of constant conversation in NaNoWriMo about whether you should plan your novels, meaning like outline them or do something else, many planning tools out there, or pants your novels, which means just start by the seat of your pants. And we literally have people who on October 31st at midnight will start their novel and not really know even the story idea. That's extreme pantsing. But there's also something in between called plantsing, where people take the best of planning and the best of pantsing and try to find that balance. So I'd love to hear right now, what would you tell somebody, especially at this point in their novel writing journey, if they're going to start on November 1st?
Well, I do a lot of my outlining while I draft. So I usually, at the very beginning of embarking on a new draft, I'll have kind of a general idea of where things are going to go and what's going to happen and kind of maybe what the character arcs might be. But my drafting process tends to be like just a lot of work, and then I stop and then I plan in detail the next, 10 chapters, 15 chapters, do that work, see where I end up, and just kind of do it as I go. And I find that this is like the most flexible way for me to plan, because I do like to plan things out. But I think when you're actually in the draft and in all of those details, things tend to change, or you get excited about something and you want to go in a different direction. And so I think if you only really have a general story idea at this point, maybe, spend the next couple days just thinking about a general outline, and you can kind of plan as you go. Like, that works for me.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Anybody else on the topic of planning? Who's a planner? Who's a planner here? Okay. Molly and Christina.
I have what I think of as like an incremental planning method, where I start, with the idea, come up with the ending, and it's sort of like the where I want to go with that. I spend a couple weeks usually thinking of stuff that I want to go down within the framework of that story, and just sort of, brainstorming, cobbling a whole bunch of ideas together. Then I break all those ideas into 3 acts, usually for me, but 5 acts, however many acts that you want. And then, put it in chronological order. And then I will outline 1 act at a time, like fully. I'll do like a couple chapter or a couple sentence summary of each chapter. And then as I draft that chapter, I will take that couple sentences and actually expand it out into a detailed outline. But that's as far as I go on a chapter by chapter basis. So I don't plan as much ahead. I still leave myself a lot of wiggle room. So if I want to change something, or if I need to, it's like, oh, well, I planned on this character, being here for this scene, but they are now deceased. Then that's, I haven't written myself into a corner. And that way it still stays pretty fresh for me. At least, I have low standards for freshness. I am a apex Virgo, but it stays still like, there's still some discoveries that I can make and fun things that I can throw in there. But at the same time, I still have enough of a structure that I feel comfortable where I'm going with that story, or with that particular scene, with that chapter, with that act.
I like what you said about that. There are still discoveries while you're writing. It can't be just all determined beforehand. Right. Christina, you raise your hand as a planner. How do you plan? There's so many ways to plan.
I just quickly Googled this. I don't know if people can you can't see it. Anyway, you can Google it later. I use something that's called Freytag's plot structure.
Oh yeah.
It looks like this. And so I try to know the exposition, where it's starting, the inciting incident, the climax, all those points. I try to have vague ideas of that, and then sort of fill it in while I'm drafting something. Most of the time it comes while I'm drafting, but in rare cases when it just all comes to me at once, I just sort of plot it all out and then weirdly try to follow it. I've posted this a lot in my Instagram stories, so if anyone wants to go back and see, I use it very often, and it does help me a lot.
Cool.
Yeah.
Echo, now with your process, I'm very curious, because I sometimes tell people that NaNoWriMo can be a planning exercise unto itself. Writing a rough draft can be a way of starting to plan a novel. And so I'm curious, since you write more in that style, do you find that writing the rough draft is a way to plan your novel? I mean, they're a little bit different, since I guess they're memoir-esque for you.
Yeah, I don't really think of it as planning. It's really interesting for me to hear everybody's process, because I'm like, wow, I couldn't imagine. I think I heard a quote or something of another writer who said it's like driving in the dark, and then slowly it starts to reveal itself. And that's exactly how it is for me. I think even if I sat down and tried to write an outline, what actually ended up coming out would be very different. So maybe that's the discovery process you were talking about. So for example, I just finished my second book, and I had in my mind this kind of scene that I wanted to happen, and I had titled it, and I said, this is going to happen. But then as soon as I started writing, it was clear that was just not going to be a part of the story, because what was coming through was totally different. So I will say with my first book, I did have to go through a breaking the story process. So I kind of wrote the whole first draft, all the pieces were there, but then I had to rearrange them so that the story clicked in a different way. With this story, the second book, it just came out. The whole structure came out, the whole story came out. I may have had to move some scenes. I hope that means my channeling has gotten better, but yeah, I couldn't imagine outlining or trying to plan or trying to know what happens. I just kind of drive in the dark. And then even as I'm writing, I'll be like, oh, that's very interesting. Oh, that's so interesting. I never would have thought of that, because that's how external the process feels for me. It doesn't even feel like I'm thinking of it. It feels like it just comes through again. So it's really interesting to hear other people's process with this.
That's great. Yeah, I love that metaphor. It's just you can see just as far as your headlights in the dark. Yeah. Well, hey, we're at time here. I'm going to ask each of you to think of one bit of galvanizing writing advice that you would send off our NaNoWriMo writers with, so that on November 1st they can write all 30 days and succeed. I don't know. I'll draw names out of a hat. I feel like I haven't started with Christina yet. Christina, what would be the advice you'd give NaNoWriMo writers on November 1st?
Stick to a schedule. Try your best to stick to a schedule. And don't beat yourself up if you can't do the whole 50K. It's good that you even decided to try to do something like that in this month or November. So
that is so key. Yeah, it is all about helping people write. We want people to write. So if you don't hit 50K, if you hit 30K, that's a lot to celebrate there. If you hit 10K, that's a lot to celebrate. So Katie, how about you next?
Yeah, kind of on the same note, I would say my biggest piece of advice is if you do have an off day, if you have a couple days where you're not hitting your goals. When you wake up the next morning, just try again. Like, let's set all of that guilt and whatever other feelings you have about quote unquote failure aside, because ultimately, at the end of the month, you'll have written more than you would have otherwise, even if it's not the full 50K. And as Grant said, I've done NaNoWriMo a number of times, and I was telling him before this event that I don't think I've ever actually hit the 50K, but I have published 2 books. So, it all shakes out in the end.
That's great. Echo, how about you? Echo, I should tell you just learned what National Novel Writing Month was today. So you don't have to give advice particular to NaNoWriMo, but just writing advice in general to send people off with.
I would say, sorry to be the weird spiritual girl here, but I would say my advice is you are enough to write from that place. That has really been a shift for me, to write from the fullness of that. You are enough, and nobody's going to tell the story how you will tell it. Exactly.
I feel like that kind of off the page advice can be the most important advice for writers to succeed. So thank you for that. And Margaret, to wrap things up.
I would say figure out what will make you fall in love with what you're working on and lean into that. I don't care if it's like the most nonsense draft. If you give yourself something that you just love with your whole heart, that just sets your little drafting spirit on fire, that is going to carry you through a draft better than any outline, any blocker, anything that just makes you sets you on fire to write. That is the most important thing.
Yeah. It's got to have meaning and passion and enliven you and give you joy. So thank you so much, everyone. This was so interesting. I want to tell people or encourage them to buy your wonderful books at Odyssey Bookshop, which Catherine has put the link up for everyone to go. Can't show all the books, but here they are. I won't drop them this time. They're very precious. They held up very well on that. So buy everyone's books. And if you can donate to NaNoWriMo, that is also deeply appreciated. Marissa Meyer is giving a $5,000 match this hour, and I listed those wonderful prizes, which include winning this whole collection of books. So we're giving away three book bundles. So thanks so much, everyone. Happy writing in November. Happy nano prepping in the next 2 days. And thank you for the wisdom you all guys gave today.
Thank you. Good luck, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.